This episode of Stories from the Vault is brought to you by Petty Merch. Get 15% off your first order with code VAULT at pettymerch.xyz. This episode contains descriptions of mass casualty violence, large-scale destruction, and victim impact. Viewer discretion is advised. April 19th, 1995 started like any other Wednesday in downtown Oklahoma City. Children were dropped off at daycare. Federal employees arrived for work. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building stood at the corner of 5th and Harvey, a busy hub of public services and government offices. At 9:02 a.m., a massive explosion tore through that building. Concrete, glass, and steel collapsed into a roar that could be heard blocks away. A bright column of smoke rose into the clear spring sky. People were trapped beneath rubble. Cars were crushed. The day that began with normal, ordinary routines became, in a matter of seconds, the worst act of domestic terrorism America had ever seen. If you're following along, hit like to support the series, subscribe to stay updated, and drop a comment with what FBI file you want me to open next. The blast at the Murrah building was not an accident. It was a truck bomb parked in front of the north face of the building, an inferno that destroyed a third of the structure and collapsed the east side into a pile of rubble. The human cost was immediate and immense. 168 people were killed. Among them were federal employees, contractors, passerbys, and 19 children who were inside a daycare center on the second floor. Hundreds more were injured. Entire families lost their anchors in a single morning. First responders arrived within minutes. Firefighters, paramedics, police, and civilians dug through debris with their hands. They pulled out survivors and the dead. The scene was chaotic, saturated with dust and smoke, but it was also where ordinary people refused to look away. Volunteers arrived with shovels, with blankets, with water, hospitals filled beyond capacity. The enormity of the scene required a response like no other. Within hours, the FBI activated a massive investigative effort. The scene was cordoned off and cataloged. Evidence had to be preserved. Every fragment, metal, glass, labeling on a tire, a shredded receipt could be a lead. The Murrah building had been turned into a crime scene covering an entire city block. The scale of what happened demanded a scale of response no agency had previously faced on domestic soil. The FBI assembled a task force with local, state, and federal partners. They called it OKBOMB. OKBOMB became one of the largest and most intensive criminal investigations in FBI history. For weeks and months, agents combed through the rubble. They collected tons of debris, cataloged pieces of metal and paper, and reconstructed fragments of the vehicle used in the attack. Investigators photographed everything. They logged every item with exacting detail. Evidence was tagged, bagged, and stored. Work at the scene was painstaking. Forensic teams examined blast patterns to determine the origin point. Explosive residue was tested and matched to components consistent with a large nitrate-based charge. Investigators followed the mechanical traces that the blast left behind. Skid marks, tire tracks, and the void where a vehicle had once sat. A key breakthrough came from the truck itself. Investigators focused on fragments that could identify the vehicle: an axle, a portion of a bumper, partial license tagging, rental paperwork recovered in pieces. Those fragments, when pieced together with witness statements and surveillance photos, pointed to a rented Ryder truck. The Ryder truck had been leased in Junction City, Kansas. The rental records combined with other evidence connected the vehicle to the name used by the renter. Investigators followed paper trails, permission forms, receipts, and pickup records. Every clerical piece mattered. A receipt, a copy of a rental agreement, and a drop note. These were all the threads they could pull. While the bomb task force was excavating Murrah, local law enforcement in Perry, Oklahoma, and surrounding counties were conducting routine activity. A man driving a suspicious vehicle was stopped during a traffic check. No flashy chase, no cinematic gun battle, just a routine stop that, in the context of the day, would prove consequential. Within hours of the blast, the suspect was arrested for unrelated violations during a traffic stop. He was detained as a person of interest. The combination of forensics evidence from the blast site and investigative leads from the rental records directed investigators towards him and towards his associates. Once agents had a primary suspect in custody, the investigation widened. People do not act in complete isolation when organizing an attack of this magnitude. So, the FBI and its partners began tracing suspect movements, purchases, and associates. A second individual emerged in the files, someone who had assisted in procurement and planning. Purchasing records revealed where quantities of ammonium nitrate, fertilizer, and other materials had been bought. Bank records and receipts were cross-referenced. The more agents dug, the more patterns appeared. The investigation also led into networks of anti-government sentiment. Agents documented associations with survivalist circles, militia groups, and like-minded individuals who exchanged rhetoric about the Waco siege and Ruby Ridge, both of which were raw wounds for certain extremist subcultures. Vault documents show agents identifying ideological framing that suggested motive, a perception of government overreach, and an appetite for violent retaliation. But motive alone does not convict. The Bureau continued hunting evidence, phone records, travel logs, rental agreements, witness interviews. They conducted interviews by the thousands. In total, OKBOMB logged tens of thousands of interviews, tens of thousands of tips poured in from the public. Every tip was evaluated. Many were dead ends. Crucial few were not. Informants and cooperating witnesses came forward. Some who had once been peripheral to the plot provided details about planning and logistics. The fruits of that cooperation helped investigators reconstruct who had bought what, who had loaded the vehicle, and who drove at what time. At the same time, the FBI worked to ensure evidence could hold up in court. Chain of custody protocols were strict. Memorandums charted every transfer of material evidence, every fingerprint lift, every DNA swab. Agents knew the case would be scrutinized not only by the public, but by judges and juries. So the paper trail had to be impeccable. Now we're going to stop right here in the vault for a moment, and I want to tell you a story that was actually brought to me right before I started recording. A friend of mine, John Walker, worked security at a Dillon's in El Dorado, Kansas, back in 1995. He remembers the day FBI agents came in from the Wichita office. They didn't immediately identify themselves. They couldn't without a warrant. But once they pulled up the video, everyone knew who they were. John got to watch McVeigh on the store's security footage. The system used joysticks to pan and zoom in on people, originally for tracking shoplifters. And through that video, he saw McVeigh in the store that day. The agents alluded to the fact that the money order McVeigh was cashing was intended for a car, presumably the getaway car. John's account is direct, unembellished, and it gives a rare glimpse into the early investigative work that would eventually help solve the Oklahoma City bombing case. When the case was sufficiently assembled, indictments followed. Prosecutors charged multiple defendants, those believed to have been directly involved and those who had conspired or assisted. The files show a legal strategy built on forensics, documentary evidence, and the testimonies of witnesses who had nothing left to gain by lying. The primary defendant was tried and found guilty on multiple counts, including counts of murder and conspiracy. The trial was a national event and as much as a reckoning as a legal proceeding. Victim impact statements filled the courtroom. The families of the dead described lives stopped in an instant. A child's empty chair, a parent who would not come home, a community altered forever. The evidence presented at trial was comprehensive. Court exhibits included rental agreements, surveillance photos, forensic reconstructions of the blast, residue analysis, witness testimony, and demonstrative showing how the truck had been positioned relative to the building. The verdicts were decisive. The primary defendant received the harshest penalties allowed under federal law. Co-defendants received lengthy sentences as the jury and the court considered both the scale of loss and each defendant's level of culpability. In the years following conviction, appeals and legal challenges proceeded through the federal system. The case traversed the appellate process. The criminal convictions and the sentences stood through multiple challenges. The outcome, criminal accountability and prison terms, did not bring back those who were lost, but it provided a public legal determination of responsibility. Throughout the prosecution, the vault's files preserved everything a future generation might need to understand not just who did it, but how investigators unraveled a complex conspiracy. The chain of transactions, the recovered debris, the testimony of those who cooperated, and the meticulous forensic science that confirmed the links. Oklahoma City's wounds did not heal overnight. The attack left a physical scar on the city, an emotional scar on the nation. A memorial rose on the blast site, an open space framed by a reflecting pool, a field of empty chairs, each representing a life taken, large and small. It's a place not for spectacle, but for remembrance. On a policy level, the bombing transformed how federal facilities were protected. Public buildings were reassessed. Setback distances were increased. Street-level access was restricted. Truck barriers and bollards became standard features outside government buildings. Security design moved from afterthought to first principle in federal construction and planning. For the FBI, OKBOMB became a blueprint for large-scale domestic terrorism investigations. The Bureau modernized evidence handling, expanded explosive ordnance expertise, and deepened interagency partnerships. The task force model, bringing together local, state, and federal assets under a single coordinated investigative command, was refined into the standard response for future incidents. The case also altered how the country understood domestic extremism. No longer were violent acts of political rage anomalies hidden at the edges of society. The bombing showed that homegrown actors, motivated by ideology and rage, could perpetrate mass death on American soil. Law enforcement adapted, and the public, angry and grieving, demanded better prevention and accountability. But policy and procedure are only one part of the legacy. The human side endures. Survivors rebuilt their lives. Families kept the memory of their lost loved ones alive through stories, photographs, and annual memorials. The memorial's empty chairs are a reminder that every statistic is a person with relationships, promises, and future plans that were abruptly ended. Vault documents preserved and now accessible keep the record. They give researchers and the public a means to understand exactly how the investigation proceeded, why investigators made the choices they did, and how the proof was assembled. Those documents do not heal grief, but they do make history accountable. The Oklahoma City bombing tested the limits of investigative capacity and the resilience of a community. It demonstrated the power of coordinated investigative work, the slow, tedious, exacting labor that turns rubble into leads and leads into justice. If you want to dive into the documents yourself, the FBI vault contains copious files, task force memos, evidence logs, witness statements, and trial exhibits. They show the work in granular detail, every call logged, every interview transcribed, every piece of evidence cataloged. Next time on Stories from the Vault, we will examine Ruby Bridge, standoff that together with Oklahoma City and Waco, reshaped the relationship between dissident movements and federal law enforcement in the 1990s. Until next time, remember, justice isn't always blind, and the truth is rarely redacted forever. This has been Stories from the Vault. I'm Kyle Fields. Take care.